It's Monday, June 1st. I'm Lucie Steiner.
And I'm Sam Seder. Which of these stories will you be talking about today?
Massive protests against police brutality swept across the country this weekend, and in almost every major city, the police responded with disproportionate, indiscriminate violence, attacking protesters, bystanders, and journalists. And in almost every major city, the police responded with disproportionate, indiscriminate violence, attacking protesters, bystanders, and journalists with almost every weapon in their arsenal save for live rounds. Meanwhile, Donald Trump declares Antifa a terrorist organization, making it the official position of the U.S. government that fighting fascism is an illegal act. So I guess that would make them the fascists then. And lastly, Trump announced on Friday that the U.S. is terminating ties with the World Health Organization as the worldwide death toll from the novel coronavirus approaches 375,000.
You are listening to Majority FM's AM Quickie, and these are the stories you need to know.
The police are out of control. In almost every major city in America, widespread protests broke out on Friday night and continued through the weekend in response to the murder of Minneapolis resident George Floyd at the hands of the police. Local police in nearly every city responded with indiscriminate violence, apparently taking their cues from the bloodthirsty cops in Minneapolis. In New York, police pepper sprayed crowds at Brooklyn's Barclays Center on Friday night and beat protesters in the street, setting off multiple clashes throughout the city that continued on Saturday and Sunday nights. Protesters burned multiple police vehicles, but came off far worse in the clashes as police rammed them with cars, beat them with clubs, and arrested hundreds. Mayor and failed presidential candidate Bill de Blasio's own daughter was arrested with the protesters, which didn't stop him from siding with the cops in a public statement. Speaking of an incident in which the NYPD rammed protesters with cars, he said, quote, "If those protesters had just gotten out of the way, we wouldn't be talking about this situation," unquote. In Louisville, 7 people were shot during the first night of the widespread protests on Friday, though no one was killed. Police claim they weren't behind the shootings. Demonstrations in Dallas saw chaos as well, as a man rushed protesters with a machete. In Salt Lake City, a man with a bow and arrow tried to shoot at protesters who then burnt his car. And in Minneapolis, a tanker truck tried to ram through protesters occupying the highway. Throughout it all, the police continued an all-out offensive on both demonstrators and the press, firing rubber bullets and pepper balls directly at journalists in multiple cities. So where's our leadership? Well, in Washington, D.C., protesters set fires near the White House on Saturday night, forcing the Secret Service to turn off the building's exterior lights and fire tear gas at protesters. Meanwhile, Donald Trump hid in an underground bunker reserved for terrorist attacks. Joe Biden is largely silent, and many of the country's governors and mayors are convinced the protests are being fueled by, quote, outside agitators, because they're desperate for any excuse to not examine their own failures. The police are the only ones in power, and they're just using it to inflict pain. While hidden in his bunker below the White House with all the lights off on Sunday, Trump tweeted that the U.S. government would be, quote, designating Antifa as a terrorist organization, unquote. The wording here is important, mostly because it doesn't mean anything legally. The United States doesn't have a domestic terrorism statute, so it can't designate a homegrown group as a terrorist organization. It also doesn't mean anything because Antifa just stands for anti-fascist. It's not one organization or group. It's more of a shared ideology and commitment to direct action against fascists. The proclamation comes hand in hand with the government's insistence that much of the protesting has been inspired by outside agitators, a conspiracy that NBC News found had little bearing in fact. But try telling that to Trump. It's clear from this tweet that the president is paving the way to start cracking down on organized leftism and scapegoating a familiar conservative media boogeyman at the same time, which will surely be weaponized as protests continue across the country. If anti-fascists are considered terrorists, the U.S. might as well up and change the stars on its flag to a different symbol.
Hey, Majority.fm's AM Quickie is fueled by JustCoffee.coop. Just Coffee is a worker-owned coffee roaster based in Madison, Wisconsin that has sponsored the Majority Report for nearly a decade. Check out their collection of fair trade roasts, including our own Majority Report blend, and regardless of what you order, receive 10% off of your order when you use the code MAJORITY at checkout. All shipping, of course, is free. That's coupon code MAJORITY at justcoffee.coop.
Even outside the massive crisis of police violence, Trump's government continues its slow erosion of every international norm we've ever worked to build. On Friday, Trump announced that the U.S. would be terminating all ties with the World Health Organization, putting the cap on a month-long campaign to malign the international organization and deflect blame from his own abysmal leadership. We're just a few thousand deaths away from 375,000 worldwide. More than a quarter of those, over 100,000, are in the U.S. There's no way that's the WHO's fault, but Trump is grasping at straws and willing to drag the world down with him. The U.S. provided $893 million to the WHO in 2018 and 2019. Hopefully, Trump won't be in office long enough to really blow out the organization's budget, but there's no way around it. The U.S. is cutting off the WHO will be disastrous for global public health. Fortunately, it's not like we're in any kind of massive pandemic that's expected to keep happening as new diseases arise. Oh, wait.
And now, for some quicker quickies.
Quicker Quickie.
The New York Times has a new exhaustive video breaking down the moments of George Floyd's death, which adds much-needed context to the traffic stop that led up to his murder, thanks to security cameras and other witness videos that show how the police breached their own policy multiple times. Protesters lit fires in the Daughters of the Confederacy building in Richmond and defaced a statue of Robert E. Lee while they were at it. Couldn't have happened to two nicer and more important parts of our country's heritage, could it? A new Washington Post and ABC News poll shows Joe Biden ahead of Donald Trump by 10%, 53 to 43%, as the president's approval rating continues to drop during the pandemic. That said, there's still a long way to go until November. Democratic incumbents are massively outraising Republicans in key House races coming up in November, and the GOP is pretty worried that it's losing any shot of taking back the House. Money in politics may be a fundamentally broken game, but hey, at least the slightly less bad party is winning.
Quicker Quickie.
That's it, folks. Thanks for listening to the Majority.fm's AM Quickie. Sam?
Thank you, Lucie. And don't forget to join us today, live at noon on The Majority Report or later as a podcast.